about the new Christians of Apulia that obtain a papal bull to fend off accusations of Judaizing from 1446. We have, as usual, three speakers. Our text presenter is Professor Benjamin Scheller. He's received his doctorate with the Humboldt University of Berlin in 2002. He's a professor of history of the late Middle Ages and the early modern times at the Department of History at the University of Duisburg-Essen in Germany. And his research focuses on issues of religious conversion and its consequences on Italian protagonists of the European expansion into Africa during the late Middle Ages, and on the emergence of the application of the concept of risk in maritime sea trade. In 2013, he published a monograph, Die Stadt der Neuchristen, Konvertiteure, Juden und ihre Nachkommen in Trani, das Spätmittelalters in Berlin, came out with the Greuters. He will be our text presenter discussing individuals who were accused of Judaizing in Apulia in the 15th century. And we have correspondents, Nadia Zeldes, Nadia Zeldes, a member of our center, a senior researcher in our center for the study of conversion and religious encounters at the University of the Negev. Her PhD is from Tel Aviv University in 1997. She has authored The Former Jews of This Kingdom, Sicilian Converts After the Expulsion from 1492 to 1416, came out in Brill in 2003. Her main areas of interest on which she had published a number of articles include the intercultural encounters in the Mediterranean world, Jews, conversos, and Christians, the problem of Jewish converts in Christianity in Sicily and southern Italy, and related topics. I'm not going to read her entire list of publications, but Nadia has published extensively on this topic. And our second respondent is another member of our center, Dr. Sorotzkin. Dr. David Sorotzkin is a scholar and critic of modernity, religion, secularization, the identities, and politics in Israel. His research focuses on core historical questions and problems concerning modern European and Jewish identities in early and late modern times. His book is titled Orthodoxy and Modern Disciplination, the production of the Jewish tradition in Europe in the modern times, came out in Tel Aviv with Kibbutz HaMeluchat Press in 2011, and his other publication examined the process that produces the social and identitational structures of modern Judaism in early and late modern Europe. Recently, he has finished writing a comprehensive research on the role of Catalonian Orthodoxy, an interesting term, using the term orthodoxy and juxtaposing it back into the past of the late Middle Ages in the shaping of modern Judaism, and he's a research fellow here at the center. So these are our three speakers, and I hand it off to Benjamin.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe I took the request to submit 6 lines of a short CD too literally. But anybody who should be interested in my publications, you know, in the age of Google, you can look it up.
Academia,
for instance, also. And I also would like, I'm thankful for the invitation to this conference, which gives me the opportunity to present some observations I have made in my work on the converts of southern Italy and their descendants in the late Middle Ages. And I hope this works out. Yeah. Get back at all? You can leave it like this. It's okay.
Just right.
And the text that we're going to look at reflects on an important chapter of this history, the history of an overlooked mass conversion of Jews to Christianity in the later Middle Ages and its consequences. And this mass conversion occurred in the Kingdom of Naples in the years around 1290, 1292. And I have a slide here. You can see the towns of the Kingdom of Naples where converts are documented, and the documentation comes from privileges of exemption that the King of Naples granted to these converts in 1294. So, and here in these privileges, the names of the converts were mentioned, and this is where we get this statistics from. Most of the documents are no longer existent. Some of them are, some of them aren't. So we have to rely for most of the statistics on the work by Italian scholar Nicola Ferrarelli, who published a book about the Jews of southern Italy. I think it was 1915. Thank you. So, but okay. So this is this, and you can see that these the places, the towns, are in Apulia and in Campania, whereas in Calabria, which is also a part of the Kingdom of Naples at the time, there were no conversions. Sometimes you find it in the literature, but there's no that there are no conversions are documented for Calabria. This has political reasons, or reasons of political circumstances. What is interesting, of all, you have over 20 towns for the Kingdom of Naples where we have conversions documented, but for most of these towns, references to converts disappear from the documentation after the first half of the 14th century, with one exception, and this is Trani, a port town on the Apulian coast where this rather ugly arrow is pointing at. And here we have a continuous documentation of converts, and not only converts but also their descendants throughout the later Middle Ages, starting even in the years before 1292, even before the mass conversion. There are some conversions also documented already in the 1260s, and we have a continuous documentation until the middle of the 16th century, and then I have stopped looking. So maybe there are also references after the middle of the 16th century. And these converts were labeled as first, before 1292, they were labeled as Christiani Conversi or Olim Judaei, but this changes in 1292, 1294, when they are usually up from then on, they're usually labeled as Christiani Novi, Neophyti, or since the 15th century we also have a vernacular label which is Cristiano Novello. And the two pictures you're seeing are from Trani on the right. This is the former synagogue, Scola Nova, transformed into church after the mass conversion in 1292, and some years ago reconverted into a synagogue. So, which is a rather interesting story that I got across when I did my research there, which was rather, for me, was a strange experience, being a trained academic historian and seeing somehow history coming to life again. Okay, on the left is the famous Cathedral of Trani. When I talk of the consequences, when I'm speaking of the consequences of the mass conversion, I'm speaking mainly of the social consequences. This is what interested me in this case. Yesterday, we spoke about conversion as being the ticket of entrance into the larger society, in the Western Middle Ages, meaning the Christian society. And I was interested how the converts and the descendants used this ticket. Could they use it at all? Was it a valid ticket? Did the larger society, the Christian society, concede them access? And how was society, urban society mainly, as a whole, transformed by this mass conversion? Because it is a quite substantial number of converts, as already mentioned in 1294. It's 310 households for Trani alone. We don't have the statistics for that time for the overall sum of households, but in 1495, when we have still attested 120 households of Cristiani Novelli, it's 120 of 800 households of the whole city. So it's still quite a substantial part of the urban population. Yeah, this is why I would sustain the hypothesis that it is not only that the mass conversion prompted a transformation of urban society as such. Trying to analyze the transformation of urban society as a consequence of the mass conversion of 1292 prompts some rather difficult methodological questions, and these are due mainly to the situation of evidence for the late medieval peninsula Italian South. It is known to all of the scholars of the Kingdom of Naples and Peninsula South in the later Middle Ages that the Archivio di Stato of Napoli's archival records for the most part of the Middle Ages were destroyed in the Second World War. But we have transcriptions by humanist scholars and also by scholars up to the Second World War, which are being collected and which is sometimes also, I found some of them that were unknown in archives in Bari and Bitonto. This is material you can work with, but also the documentary situation in the towns is not, I'd say, great compared to the situation for Tuscany or northern Italy. There is no urban historiography particularly. So, and I continue with what is also not there. No inquisitorial records, and there are no rabbinical responsa contemporary. Only in the middle of the 16th century maybe there's one that is referring to the Cristiani Novelli. And there is no polemical literature, but one treatise from around 1495 by a humanist from the Salento, who treats the question whether the neophyte, as he calls them, can become nobles. He doesn't ask whether they are good Christians or not. He asks the questions whether they can aspire ranks of the nobility, which is rather telling for the southern Italian case. So what we have are royal mandates and some charters too. We have notarial records, we have registers of property, and we also have some papal bulls. So this is the material we have to work with when we are trying to scrutinize and analyze the history of the Cristiani Novelli of southern Italy. This doesn't work. This is the nightmare of the PowerPoint presenter. I'll try it. Maybe I'll try it like this. Okay, just to give you an impression, because you see on the right side, this is the register of property by the Church of Trani from the early 16th century, which is an original. Up left, you see a notarial deed from the Archivio Capitolare di Trani, from the ecclesiastical archive, and the three other documents. No, and on the bottom right is a notarial deed from a notarial register from Bitonto. This is a small town in the suburb of Bari today, and up in the middle is a transcription from the mandates of the Royal Chancery, but which is only some in Italian of an originally Latin document. You see, this is the kind of material you have to work with, and you have to be very careful working with this kind of material. So what can you do with this kind of material? So if you try to analyze the transformation of urban society, the first thing I did was writing a prosopography, which is quite a challenge, and this is what came out. You have these families and the members of the family, and you see in the footnotes is the whole material, but I didn't stop there. I tried with this prosopography, based on this prosopography, I tried to analyze several dimensions of social interaction, let's say, to get a multi-dimensional approach to transformation, social transformation. One of this is politics. I've given a brief outline of the change in the political situation of the Cristiani Novelli in the introduction to my text. First, the Jews were subject to the bishops in southern Italy. And what is interesting for Trani, that the bishop succeeded in maintaining this power over the Jews even after their conversion. So they still had to pay taxes like before to the archbishop, and they still were under his jurisdiction. And this went on until the end of the 14th century. So for 100 years after the conversion, that on a political and juridical level, they were still treated as Jews by the Archbishop Esteban. And this changed in the 15th century. In 1413, we have where the king approves the charter or gives the charter for a reform of urban government, and here mentioned we see that the Neophyte have become part of the urban council, which is made up by 8 nobles, 6 populares, and 2 Neophyte. So they obviously gained access to urban government in the beginning of the 15th century, and that in the middle of the 15th century, this position they have achieved kind of gets challenged. And this is what the text that we are going to look at in a few minutes is also about, I'd say. It is a first document for a period of factional strife and urban unrest in which the Christiani novelli are trying to get involved, and during which their position in the urban society is being challenged. This period lasts about 20 years. Most of them leave the town in the 50s and the 1450s, but return in 1464. Okay, maybe this is the dimension of politics. Did they return in 1464? Urban government gets reformed once again. They get an even greater share of the seats in the urban council in 1466, but they are no longer referred to as Neophyte, but as Mercanti or Mercatores from this time on. And what now begins is, I'd say, is the golden age of the Apulian, of the Neophyte of Trani, which ends in 1495. In this year, the King of France, Charles VIII, invades the Kingdom of Naples, and it erupts a series of uprising against Jews, but also against the Christiani novelli of Trani. They get expelled from Trani, but they relocate in neighboring towns. And here we find them, as I said, until the middle of the 16th century at least. Some also in Venice, where you can find them also in the documentation. One second thing that we can look at with the sources we have is urban space. I won't indulge on this, I'll just give you the map. One is the map of where the property is located. We can do this only for the 15th century, where it is located before the middle of the 15th century and after. This is what we can do with these sources. On the right, you can also see where property is located that was transferred and where they and which transfers they acted as witnesses. So, because normally you were called to the place where the transaction took place, and you all can see in a way there are spaces of action in town. Another thing you can see is social networks. Analyze social networks by looking at the lists of witnesses in notarial deeds. You see some of these lists here, bottom left and upper right. And I did it for the time before 1464 and after 1464, because in 1464 they returned to the town, so we can make a cut. We can have a situation of before and after. And what we can see from this is very interesting, because you can see, I don't know if any of you know something about the methods and all the concept of social network analysis. It not only uses graphs, it only uses numbers, terrible for historians sometimes. And what you can see here is one of the parameters of social network analysis is centrality. And one very basic parameter is degree centrality, means number of social ties in a given network. And you can see that among the 10 families in Turkey with the highest number of social ties in the network that we can extract from these witness lists. We have an increase of the Cristiani Novelli after 1464. Before 1464 is just 2 of the 10 families with the highest sacrality in the network, and after 1464 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, if I count correctly. Which hints at them getting more and more central, playing a more and more central role in urban society in the second half of the 15th century. Which is interesting because we can also look at the density of the relations among themselves. And here we see they not only get more and more central, also the relations in the group get more and more, denser after 1464. Okay.
What does it mean that the family has 15,000?
No, it's 15. It's 15 or 15,000. It's 15 point, no, not 15,000, sorry.
Okay.
15 point, so okay. No, 15,000 would be quite a lot. So many, we have about 300 notarial deeds for the whole 15th century that we could look at. But you have quite a number of witnesses in one deed, up to 11. So you get, I think I got about 3,000 documented contacts among persons in this witness list. So, in a sum. Okay. The next thing is, what I looked at is at the semantics also, which is also quite interesting, which you also can extract from the documentation. You can see that here is a shift that is occurring at the beginning of the 16th century. And I looked at the distinction. What was the opposition? And from the end of the 13th century up to the end of the 15th century, it was Neofiti Cristiani Novelli on the one side versus Ali Cristiani, or Ali Christi Fidelis on the other side. Which means it was the distinction between new Christians and other Christians. And this changes at the beginning of the 16th, or towards the end of the 15th and the beginning of the 16th century, because on first hand, there is a new term that gets imported from Spain via Venice, this Marani, which appears in the sources of Apulia for the first time, and I think in 1497, and in the 2 towns that were pledges to Venice, that the King of Naples pledged to Venice, which is Terni and also Monopoly. And what is even more important, beginning with the 16th century, there's a new. There is a new opposition. This is Cristiano de Natura. So the distinction is Cristiano Novello versus Cristiano de Natura, which is also an import from Spain, because ever since 1503, Kingdom of Naples was part of the Spanish Empire, and this marked a major change, and was all, as far as I'm concerned, also one of the reasons why the situation for them towards the end of the 15th century turned to the worse. So, but one enigma remains, and the enigma is what normally is at the heart of the discussion of conversion, or what for a long time has been at the heart of the discussion on conversion. What we in German say is the Gretchenfrage, the question that Gretchen asked Faust, wie hältst du es mit der Religion? The question of religious conduct. And and I, as a kind of to symbolize this question, I took the photograph of the sign of the church that I took in 2005 or 6, I think. He's written Chiesa di Santa Maria Scuola Nova, già synagoga, which is kind of Christian, but also Jewish building, once Jewish, but you can't see it here. With a very thin pencil, someone has put the jar in brackets and has written Ora above it, which means today. So it's an interesting story of layers of religious identity of the building. Synagogue, church, synagogue. And so this is, And now we're coming to the text. As I told you, this is in 46, 46. the position the Cristiani Novelli had achieved up till then, was put into question, and the document that we are looking at now is the first document that testifies this. It's a papal bull dating from the 26th of February 1446, and as I said in my introduction, this is one of the few documents that addresses the matter of the religious conduct of the Cristiani Novelli at a certain length, and is also one of the few documents through which we kind of can hear their voice, when maybe in a distorted way, that a papal bull could only be obtained when someone submitted a supplic to the papal curia. So they approached the Pope to get this document, to get this bull, and also the contents of the document of these bulls are very much formulated by those who submit the supplic, because normally the content of the bull is already part of the supplic. In English you say supplic, you don't say supplication, how do you say it?
Request.
Petition, yeah, the petition, and yeah, and then it just gets copied into bull. So we can, with some justification we can say that it's really their voice, although indirectly, that we can kind of phrase in this document.
Do you know how much they have to pay? And same question.
Normally about 20 florin to get a bull, which is not that much for them. A few years later, they still have problems with Inquisitor. This period of inquisitorial activity lasts until 1464, when the king puts an end to it. In 1464, King Ferrante I gives instructions to the Luogotenente in Apulia, which is his son, and no longer to assist the inquisitors, and he also appeals to the Pope via Cardinal to stop sending inquisitors to Apulia. So and then in 1453 there is one situation where some Cristiani Novelli that are accused pay 60 ducats each, and 20 is a bit less. So this is not, the money is not the problem for this bull. This is not the problem. 20 is the normal price. I don't have seen the original document. I only have seen the edition, the document in the edition, so I don't see the, in German you call it the Kanzleivermerke, so what is written on the back, where you can, from which you could extract the exact sum. But 20 is about the average what you pay. Okay, and you can distinguish the text in several parts. The first, which is the intitulatio and the arenga, is not that interesting, but on page 4 of my of the source text, in line 58, that begins what in the terminology of diplomatic is called the narratio, and here it is told the story why the Cristiani Novelli approached the Pope, which is rather interesting for several reasons, and we could read it now, but I think maybe we don't have to read it. We come back to it. We can come back to it in the discussion. And the second part that is interesting for us begins on page 5, line 147. This is the Dispositio, where the Pope, which has 3 points that are interesting to us. The first is that the new Christians get absolved by the Pope on the base that they abjure in the time span of 14 days. The second point is that the alii Christi Fidelis, you have it in the text, are no longer to accuse them of heresy, and they are to treat them benignly and with charity. This is the second important part. And the third part is a catalogue of rules of religious conduct. The Pope sends them on their request. And this catalogue maybe prompts more question about the religious conduct of the Christian than it answers. It doesn't seem really custom fit for them. It rather seems kind of an off-the-rack tool for catechesis, and you see it at one point where it is about the burial site. The Christian Novelli don't have the Jewish burial ground has been conceded to the Dominicans in the, I think, around 39. So Jewish burial practice must have ceased a long time ago when this bull went out. Okay, but this is rather interesting. What is interesting about to come back to the second part is that they ask the Pope for a regula. So they are accused of having different ways. And maybe I can put it here. This is where is it? Now this is on page 4. Line 62 following, or maybe I'll start a bit earlier. So when we got to hear, not without great displeasure, some faithful in Christ, vulgarly called neophytes or new Christians, residing in the city and diocese of Trani, for this, that they and their ancestors, although they, enlightened by divine grace, converted from Judaism to Catholicism many years ago, are said to have observed and observed certain particular customs, rites, or modes of life, differing a lot from those of the other faithful in Christ. There's a word that hasn't been okay. In Latin it is quosta mores ritus soi vivendi modus singulares, plurimumque diversos ab illis aliorum Christi fidelium. This is the interesting part. So, in a way, my headline is not exactly precise because Judaizing is not mentioned. It's only what is said is that they have different ritus, modus, et mores. But it is connected to their Jewish ancestry and to the time before their conversion, because it is said that they have these mores and modi vivendi ever since the conversion. So this is, and for this they asked the Pope to send them this rule, regula, and the interesting point is it is on page 5. Page 5, and I start with line 127. For the salvation of their souls, they wish to totally give up the said customs, rites, and single modes, given that they have them, which is also very interesting, that they say, si quos habent. If they have them, they want to give them up. And they ask, given that they have, and to conform to the other faithful in Christ. Et aliis Christi fidelibus se in omnibus presertem fidem catholicam concernentibus confirmare, and to facilitate this confirmation, they ask the Pope for this rule. And then they get this catalogue of rules of religious conduct. Yeah, and as you see, this text poses a lot of questions, and I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions concerning the text, how we should interpret it, and how we should see it in the whole context of the history of the new Christians of southern Italy. And with that, with this open question, I'm at the end of my presentation.
Okay, I'll try to answer. First, I must congratulate Professor Scheller for taking up this topic, which is really very problematic, especially since there are so few remaining sources, which he correctly mentioned. It's really a problem, and he does a very, very interesting job of connecting the few remaining pieces, one to another. In fact, the mass conversion of the Jews of South Italy was for a very long time insufficiently understood. And it was considered to be a kind of mystery already in the 16th century, when the author of Shevet Yehuda wrote, two large communities of Naples and Trani were compelled to convert as must be. And the reason for this apostasy I could not find. This is, well, it's looking back, but even then they didn't know exactly what happened. Now, the persistence of the Neophyte under different guises, Cristiani Novelli and so on, and if you permit me, I'll first discuss the papal bull, and then I'll come to what happened later in the late 15th century and early 16th century, which I must say that I disagree a bit with Benjamin. But we'll see. Now, as I said, the persistence of the Neophyte as a distinctive group among the population of South Italy. In fact, it has not been given its due importance, especially as a social and religious fact. And what I would like to add, that perhaps it should be examined and understood not only in the local context, but or that of church policies towards the Jews and converts, all the social aspects of the convert integration, of lack of integration into the surrounding society, but also because it offers a precedent to similar developments that occurred about 100 years later in the Iberian Peninsula, and to a lesser extent in Sicily and Provence in a later period. Now, I'm going to discuss some of the points of the Baal of Pope Eugenius IV. But first I must correct a small error in the translation about the identity of the Archbishop of Trani. He is described in the translation as the Latin Archbishop, but in fact his name was Latino Ursini, and he was a member of the Roman branch of the Ursini. The bull acknowledges the distinct and persistent identity of the Neophyte of South Italy, popularly known as Cristiani Novelli, more than 100 years after their initial conversion. That's right. Even if they requested the bull, it can be understood in different ways. Maybe they wanted to anticipate an inquisitorial interrogation, inquest on their customs, and they did it in this way in order to save themselves. Well, you have to remember this is not the Spanish Inquisition, this is the Apostolic Inquisition. So by addressing themselves to the Pope, they might anticipate and maybe prevent a more in-depth investigation. However, the bull describes some of the characteristics of the Neophyte existence in South Italy, that they were shunned in a way by the surrounding society. They were accused of all sorts of customs which were not to the normal customs of the Christian population. I might add that even on a different scale, on a different level, it's true that we are talking about a different period, but still the converts of Apulia in the 14th century were ordered to live separately than the old Christians in vico separato Christopolis, apart from the faithful of Christ. The bull now describes some of the offenses of the Neophyte. It is, again, I cannot say who listed these offenses. If they addressed themselves to the Pope and said, well, we are accused of this and this and these things, and then copied in the bull, or maybe the accusations which separately which the Pope separately, there is no way to know. Now the bull describes some of the offenses, like the observance of Jewish rites and customs, particularly Shabbat observance, the grant of divorce papers, which is forbidden by the Church. It listed certain Christian customs and rituals that they should observe in the future, and it implies that they are not currently observed by the lawful. The list mentions also the celebration of the days of the Lord, and what they should observe the days of the Lord, observe Lent, baptize their children. They should partake of the Eucharist and the last rites. They should go to confession. They should be taught the Lord's Prayer. And it also mentions the burial customs, which is a bit interesting why it should be different, what is the problem with burial customs. And I think that it probably refers to the preference for burial in a cemetery outside the city or in virgin soil, as maybe, or as was the case with Iberian conversos in a later period, instead of the usual Christian burial in a churchyard, multiple burial or reburial. The neophytes are advised that at least some of them should be buried in hallowed ground. Lastly, the Pope instructs them to practice intermarriage with all Christians. 7 years later, Pope Nicholas V issued a bull in response to an investigation. This time we know that it was initiated by a Dominican inquisitor, Petrus de Mistreta. The Pope again offered to give them another chance if they would keep their promise to live as good Christians. In his bull, they are still referred as neophytes, despite the fact that 150 years have passed since their conversion. Iam sunt elapsi anni tentum quinquaginta. And they are again exhorted to abandon Jewish customs and live as faithful Christians. The bull from 1453 supplies more details on the customs of the neophytes and their offenses against the Christian religion, thus maybe shedding light on the accusations or, shall we say, advice which appears in the bull of Eugenius, which is mentioned. And it says that despite the fact that they are and despite the fact that they are publicly baptized and they partake of the sacraments in public, they still observe Jewish ceremonies. They don't believe in the Christian faith, and they are still contracting marriages only among themselves when they should marry other Christians. Moreover, they are still praying at the Jewish synagogue, at Synagoge Judeorum Agregandi. Without having more information at hand, I suppose that it meant that the neophytes chose to pray as a community in formal synagogues turned churches, like the Santa Maria Scola Nova, which was shown here, instead of other parochial churches. But, however, since we are focusing on the bull of Pope Eugenius, it is not a place to discuss in detail the bull of Pope Nicholas, but it is important to point out that apparently little has changed in the times of the previous bull. Now, as regards the end of the 15th century, I have several documents or testimonies to mention here. One of them, which dates probably from around 1492 or 1493, is a description in a Hebrew chronicle, which refers to the arrival of the exiles, the Spanish exiles, to Naples. And then it says, it's true that we're not talking only about Trani, but about other places as well. And it says that the newcomers were helped by the local Jewish community, by the Anusim, and, strangely enough, by the Dominicans. Now, this Anusim in 1492 or 1493 cannot be other than the same neophyte we are talking about, because the other mass conversion, which I will come to immediately, didn't happen before 1495. So these people were helped by the local neophyte community, which persisted and was recognized as a separate group, even by the Jews. And they are called Anusim despite all the long time that has passed over. Now, as to the name Marani. Now, this is a very, very problematic name or epithet in Italian sources. As opposed to Spanish sources, we do not know exactly what they refer to. In any case, it is very doubtful that they refer to this old Neophyte, old Cristiani Novelli, which are usually described as Cristiani Novelli. The Marani are, I'll give you, for instance, the mention of the Marani in Marino Sanuto. Not only in his diary, but also in his description of the expedition of King Charles VIII of France. And he says there that the Marani escaped to Venice. But in the same passage, he says that this Marani were from Spain, and they converted there, and that is why King Ferdinand established an inquisition against them, and so on and so on. Which means, at least according to Marino Sanuto, that he refers to people who came from Spain. Other chronicles of the late 15th century mention the Cristiani Novelli and the Marani and the Jews like different entities, which means that each group is something else. There is probably some confusion between Marani and people who come from Spain, even if they are Jews or even if they are just Cristiani de Natura. Because in various Italian sources, the name Marani is, there are lots of studies on the subject, and it is very difficult to say exactly what the Italians meant by Marani. They certainly meant people coming from Spain. For instance, although it is quite late to this period, and you can mention Machiavelli the Prince, where he mentions the expulsion of the Marani from Spain. And, well, who are these Marani? They are certainly not Moriscos, which was suggested by some people. Yeah. They are certainly not really Marani, because we know that the expulsion from Spain, as opposed to other expulsions, referred only to Jews. They didn't include conversos. So it is a big problem who exactly the Marani are in this case. And anyway, those who arrived to Venice, at least according to Sanuto, were Marani, probably Jews, the Jewish refugees who came from Spain, from the Iberian Peninsula, and settled later in Venice. Lastly, about the later fate of the Neophyte. In 1510, an edict of expulsion decreed that all Jews and all conversos should be expelled from South Italy, and this edict should have been implemented by 1511. Now, the question is whom it included. Now, Ferrorelli states an agreement that left in the kingdom 200 Jewish families. This is also a bit problematic. Where could they warrant? We know that Rabanels, for example, remained in the kingdom of Naples. There is no doubt that the expulsion of the Jews was not complete. The expulsion of the converts was also not complete. I'm not sure that it was incomplete because the authorities made any distinction between the various groups of converts, but simply because the Kingdom of Naples was not such an ordered and organized society as Spain was. Maybe there was a lot of opposition to the expulsion, which we know that there was an opposition to the Inquisition. Maybe there was also an opposition to the expulsion. We know from Jewish sources that some people managed to bribe the authorities in order to remain, and so on and so on, which is really a problem that I won't deal with now because it is too complicated. Well, that's it. Anyway, the bull we have seen is very interesting because it is one of the first examples of any mention of Judaism practices outside of Spain. And it throws light on the life of this group, this very interesting group who survived as a group, whether it was called Neophyte or Cristiani Novelli or Mercanti or whatever else, but they maintained their own identity and they addressed not only the Pope, but also the local authorities and the king as the group. And they knew that they had this shared identity. They are also accused of endogamic marriages, which is probably a fact that they did practice them. Why they practiced them, whether it was for religious purposes or maybe for economic purposes. This is something that maybe should be studied, and here I really let Benjamin respond. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David.
Thank you very much for addressing the issue. Benjamin and Nadia, interesting remarks. And how would I define?
I'm not sure it's working.
I don't think it's working. I don't think it works. How will I define what I'm about to do now? Maybe by the phrase by Monty Python, and now for something completely different. And so I will use this text and this most interesting discussion as a platform to raise issues which interest me, issues of configurations of identity in the later Middle Ages throughout modern times. And I hope that will suit the subject well. The text in front of us is most interesting. It reveals the position and location of Jewish converts in Trani in the 40s of the 15th century. It concerns the characterization of the Neophiti, new Christians, in the urban space of Trani, and to some extent in Christian space in general. The text touches issues of identity, customs and conduct, urban space, ethnicity and otherness. As Benjamin Scheller noted in his short foreword, the question of religious conduct was deeply entangled with the question of the new Christian position in urban society. What we have here is an attempt to construct homogeneous urban space deprived of any abnormal elements, while retaining the separate status of the Neophiti. Correspondingly, the converts are clearly, legally and conceptually defined from the rest of the Christian population. This twofold pressure defines the borderline nature of converts' identity, which made them an object of more than a few historiographical and philosophical examinations. On the one hand, the demand which was directed towards them to be peeled from the remains of their Jewish customs. On the other hand, they are marked and defined from the old Christian population. Thus, a convert who wanted to completely get rid of the sediment of his Jewish origin would not have been able to do so, because he was trapped in a sociological, conceptual, and sometimes legal system which maintained his inherent separation. Past scholars and thinkers already noticed that the paradoxical position of Jewish converts may concern the origin of the modern sense of ethnicity. That is, identity which is measured primarily by origin and blood, rather than by other forms of belonging. Thus, the demand to be peeled from the past communal memory and custom while retaining a clearly defined identity pattern of new Christian pushes forward toward ethnic identity configuration. The present text mentions certain particular costume, rites, or modes of life differing a lot from those of the other faithful in Christ in the city. But later, out of these, only two are mentioned by name, which Nadia also mentioned, the celebration of Sabbath and the grant of divorce papers. The Sabbath clearly marks the Jew in space and time on a weekly basis, and the grant of divorce papers may reflect free-form bastardy and zerut. In this last matter, the subject of purity of blood, from the Jewish point of view, is the main issue. And so it is interesting that these are the customs that are directly addressed by the papal rule, by this papal rule. If indeed we ascribe, at least in one sense, the origin of modern self-aware ethnicity to the new Christian identity configuration, and I do not think at all, by the way, that this is its sole origin, we might just as well ask, ethnicity, as one of the bases of modern nationalism, for example, is similarly defined by custom. That is, successions of traditions and custom, or modes of life, arbitrary in many respects, which defines groups from one another. And if so, one may ask, how does this dialectical movement, which separates between the former Jew and his customs, and at the same time defined him through origin, blood, and conduct, occur? In order to answer this question, we must use dialectics and also observe the character of costumes and rituals among converts who returned to Judaism. The new Christian or former Jew is defined by his origin. At the same time, he is attracted to costumes and conducts which often function as an empty shell, as a mere ritualistic remnant of a holistic identity which existed in the past. The former Jew is becoming new Christian. In this framework, he is absorbed into Christian society, which defined him as a distinct entity based on origin and blood. Simultaneously, he gets rid of some of his contacts and retains some others, often, eventually, without any acknowledgement of the reason for their existence. Then, Christian society pushes him again to get rid of the remnants of his costumes. Eventually, the new Christian may assimilate into local Christian society and perhaps in time be mingled with other ethnic origins which are becoming reflective or self-aware as part of the gradual rise of early modern and modern nationalism. In the cases of converts who return to Judaism, we often find stiff adoptions of rituals and conducts cut off from their natural life which they had in the framework of Jewish communities. In any case, origin and contacts are becoming two distinct entities. Blood is becoming carrier of a distinct ethnic identity, while the newly acquired contacts are becoming bridge or vehicle by which converts reconstruct their identity. Blood is becoming the base for ethnic origin, while contacts are becoming the base for ethnic history. Thus, converts who return to Judaism simultaneously established a return into history. I defined it restorative conversion, back into former identity. It functions as a new type of restorative imagined identity which constructs a distinct ethnic origin. This type of restoration joins a totality of restorative imagined identities which define themselves from the late Middle Ages and throughout the modern times. Out of these emerge some of the major collective configurations of our time. In general, we can define these identity restorations as pre-national or early national configuration. They eventually join a variety of emergent perceptions of chosen people and common origins which established themselves in early modern Europe, in England, Holland, and elsewhere. Other matters which emerge from issues raised by this text concerns issues that I personally deal with a lot in recent years, Jewish secularization. To my understanding, Jewish secularization as a secularization in general had a wide range of sociological, perceptual, and identity context. One central concept is connected directly to Jewish-Christian relations and to the issue of conversion from Judaism to Christianity. So an act of conversion, the Jew is perceiving as taking off a shell of superfluous conducts and superstitions. Once the Jew takes off this shell, what which remains of him is pure origin, deprived of actual identity assets. In other words, mere blood. Now, late medievalist Christianity created two ideal configurations of the converted Jews, which I will define now, assimilative and distinct. According to the first configuration, assimilative, the Jew is taking off his rituals and costume in order to reveal his Christian universal essence underneath. The same structure functions later in enlightened secularized context. The Jew must take off his costumes in order to become humanized, a human being, which will enable him to take part in civil society. This is a type of secularization which I define universal. It characterizes the universal, pedagogical, imperial, and colonial tendencies of the Enlightenment. It is embodied in a perception that Christianity parallels universalism, and thus it should strive to absorb other origins. It also functions as an exclusive secularization which is based on an idea of conversion, that is, entry into the Christian colonial body, which embraces cultural and political power. In the early modern period, this type of assimilative conversion characterized ethnographers of Judaism, of which the earliest were converted Jews, such as John Pfefferkorn and Thomas Magellan. According to the second configuration of the converted Jew, which I previously called distinct, the Jew which takes off his customs retains a separate identity element. This element is essentially blood or pure origin, which Christians often perceive as contamination. This tendency became a major foundation for modern anti-Semitism, and simultaneously it also produces pre-national or early national identity pattern. In this structure, too, the Jew is taking off his earlier custom by an act of conversion, which later became an act of secularization. The remnant of the Jew is becoming the basis for an identity structure which places in its center the concept of nation and common origin, as well as customs which function as basis for common memory, or as sketches of collective history. During Enlightenment and later, these two structures of conversion split into 2 or 3 ideal models of Jewish identity. One, assimilative Judaism, which is increasingly taking off or neglecting remnants of costume and collective memories. 2, semi-secular, self-preserving Judaism, which tightens the relation between ethnic origin and history. And 3, Haredic, ultra-Orthodox Judaism, which transcendentalizes the shell of costumes and Christianized, which surround the Jew. This tendency, the sacralization of customs, which originated in its earlier form already in the later medievalist Jewish world, Ashkenazi Jewish world, reveals itself throughout the entire modern period and reaches its peak in the ruling of the prominent rabbis of the 19th century European Orthodoxy, Khatam Sofer. The 2 types of secularized converted Judaism, which I mentioned, may also relate to 2 types of secular Judaism described by Hannah Arendt, the Jew as Pariah and the Jew as Parvenu. I quote just a sentence: "To a certain extent, every Jew had somehow at some time to decide whether he would remain a Pariah and stay out of society altogether, or become Parvenu." End quote. In both cases, the Jew could not have concealed his origin, which haunted him throughout all branches of society, whether he wished to be fully assimilated into civil society or wished to retain his separateness. The complex subject of converts in the late medieval and early modern era constitute the basic structural and historical paradigms for the understanding of this phenomenon, the constitution of the Jewish problem in 18th and 20th century Europe.
Okay. Thank you very much for the 3 presentations. I'm sure we all have thoughts and comments, so please raise your hand, collect a few, and okay, so,
if I may, I would give just a short reply to the responses. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for the responses to that. Very interesting, and I don't want to say too much. And I can't say so much to what you said, David. I'm sorry, because it's just not my field, although I found it very interesting, and especially on the conceptual level. I really found it very convincing. And I don't want to come to detailed points, because this wouldn't make sense to debate details if the questions of details is not historical, because nobody would be able to follow us too. So I'd rather come to one general question. The question here is, coming back to the text, what are we going to do with it? And I would say, just to make my point clear once again, maybe, I'm rather skeptical if we can take these rules of religious conduct indicating as an indicator for the religious conduct of the Christian Novelli. And there are several reasons for it. First of all, there are contradictions between the different papal rules. The one that we read together, and the one that Nadia mentioned. Because in the second of 1453 it is said that they observe the customs of Christianity in public, but secretly adhere to Judaism. But most of the rules of the regula, most of the chapters of this regula that the Pope in 1446 sends to the Christian Novelli, consider this public ritual. Going to the church on Sundays, receiving the Eucharist, baptizing, having the children baptized. And here's my second point. it's just not very plausible that they did not get their children baptized. It's not only implausible, it's impossible, because they must have been, on the formal level, and they were Christian, and must have been Christian, otherwise they couldn't have had seats in the urban government. So this is what I meant when I said I'm not so sure whether this set of rules is really custom fit for them, or not rather kind of an off-the-rack collection of the things that a good Christian has to do. So, and this is one point. The other point is, I'm also skeptical if there are 2 points that are maybe worth considering. This is the observation of the Shabbat and divorce. This could be plausible or possible, but on the other hand, this is what every Christian knows about Jews, that they divorce. So, and there's been a long debate among historians on crypto-Judaism, how to treat these accusations. Is it just a projection? Is it things that Christians had in their minds, how Jews behaved, and now they just project it on converts? Or is it a testimony of actual religious conduct? Difficult. And third, I would say what I found interesting on the Christiani Novelli is that this question of religious conduct comes up after more than 100 years, when nobody asked for it. So it's the last times in 1341 that it was that the inquisitor that you just mentioned, Nadia, accused the neophyte of Apulia of Judaizing, and we don't hear anything of it from then until the 15th century. So this is also something that is worth thinking of, and that's it from me.
Yeah. Okay. So we have Boris, we have Anna, we have Uri, and we have. So Boris, please.
Well, you said that you are skeptical about these rules. I have no personal position, just having read them now, but I must say I don't find them absolutely impossible. Perhaps the children were baptized as late as possible, but afterward there are a number of things that one think. Well, the new Christians abstained from anything. For example, it is said that they should show up for Mass on Sundays and confess. Perhaps there is something in that, in Toledo in at the beginning of the 16th century, we hear by inquisitorial proceedings, and it's always the same problem, but we should think about it, that people come to Mass, but at the moment when the sacrament is shown, they look the other way. It's not impossible.
But in Augsburg in the 15th century, they did the same.
Sorry?
In Augsburg, where there are no new Christians in the 15th century, they do the same. The priests always complain about this behavior.
And they should receive the sacrament of Eucharist. Also in the Spanish Inquisition, we hear they do everything in order to show themselves as if they receive the sacrament, but they don't receive it.
Maybe they spit it up.
And they spit it up, and yes, perhaps. I don't know.
Sorry, because it's a bit of a question of detail. But when you show the plan of the city plans, you showed before where the properties of the Jews are, or the neophyte.
Sorry, no.
Do you find
well,
never mind.
But I get it
So I suppose you take that information from the archives of protocols? The lawyers' archives?
No, I took it from all kinds of documents, from notarial deeds about property transactions, and also there are three registers of the property of the Church of Trani, where all. So in some of them it is said in the early 15th century belonging to and Neophytus.
So is there any trace of Jewish property around the city which then transforms into new Christian property around the city? I'm asking this because it's very peculiar, because in Avila we find that the canons of the cathedral are renting and giving in census their houses to Jews, Muslims and their families, all together in the same quarters for a long, long time. So they don't get to live in ghettos or in morelias or in juderias or in any place. They are spread in the city, but they are renting from the canons, which is very peculiar. So my question was, would there be any trace of that in this place? And that's also why they go to the bishop or the pope or
the problem is that the documentation is so sparse. What we have is the property of the church, mainly, or to be precise, of the fraternity of the canons of the cathedral church, which is even more. And there is of course there must be some continuity between the property they had as Jews and when they converted, because they were under the rule of the church. So. But I'm afraid we can't answer these questions in detail as we can in Spain, because as it is often obviously possible for certain towns in Spain. Now we can't say that. The point is that I didn't say there is a Judeca in Trani until the 1430s. In the documents about property transactions, there's still mentioned a Judeca, although the Jews have converted. And it's interesting that a lot of property of the converts and the descendants is in the area that is designated as the Judeca. But, again the question, what does it say? What does it, property is something very stable, which is,
There was a German colony in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you make of it? What do you make of it? What you can see if you're looking at the lists of witnesses in property transactions, here you can see that you kind of get a broader range if you look at it. So now the property transactions in which the descendants of converted Jews act as witnesses are taking place in a broader part of the city. This is what you can get from the document. Okay.
If I understand you correctly, the purpose of the network illustration indicates that conversion was a means of expanding one's connections, one's social standing. That's is that a correct understanding?
No, obviously I didn't succeed in getting my point perfectly.
Not in my case.
No. It's just what we can see here. This is for the 15th century, so it's more than 1 century after the conversion occurred, and this is just the position. And maybe I didn't make that point. You can see there are two groups. One is in red and one is in blue. The red are the Jew Christians.
Okay.
And you can see they are.
Well,
you can extract several information from this.
So they're better connected than their families were before conversion.
This definitely, because we don't know, but of course certain forms of social interaction were impossible before that are now possible.
Okay, so there's the issue of social mobility, social opportunity, and so forth that is that conversion entails. We can assume that, we can say that based on this or not.
We can do this maybe for another place where we have more documentation. What we can say is the social mobility of the descendants of the converts in the 15th century.
I see.
And here we can see it's definitely there is a social mobility, upwards mobility of the converts. That we can extract by comparing the situation first half of the 15th, second half of the 15th century.
Another thing that, if I understand correctly, is that basically there is no means of verifying whether these regulations dealing with sinning neophytes are reflective of a real situation or were just made for some kind of warning, beware if you do it, or something of that sort. I mean, there is nothing to confirm a realia there, right?
Not really.
Okay.
I would say so, but
Yeah.
you see, here we are reaching a point where I think a question that cannot solve with the means of scientific or scholarly argument.
So,
and in a way, what is interesting for me, I don't want to solve it.
Yeah.
I see it just as indicating at certain things that are happening in the middle of the 15th century.
yeah, well, there's no doubt that these regulations are happening, but there could be something bigger that is happening that we cannot verify. Now, the question that I'm posing is, what could be that thing that these regulations are reflecting or indicating? And before I ask you to answer this question, I would like to add a piece of information from, once again, the Islamic part of the Mediterranean. And around that period, numerous narrative forms of accusations in biographic dictionaries, in treatises. These are all mentioned by a scholar named Tamer el-Laythi, who looked at Mamluk Cairo in Alexandria, where former Copts converting to Islam were constantly accused by Muslims for not being sincere converts, stressing the fact that they were practicing Christianity in their homes and maintaining their former beliefs. And it resonates so well with what you've just mentioned. And obviously these people, I think that's fair to say, these Copts converting to Islam and then becoming officials in the Mamluk bureaucracy, they were often doing this for practical reasons, social mobility and those sort of reasons. And that's why I was pushing you on the question of the network here. And the point that Laythi makes with regard to these accusations towards the former Copts is to put them under pressure, under constant notion that they are being monitored, they are being followed, so that they really be sincere, because now they've got power over other Muslims. And in Islam, from the very beginning, there is a very strong awareness of the external and the internal layers of religious affiliation. I'm not saying conviction because that's an internal level. And there is an acknowledgement that most of the converts, so long as they maintain loyalty to Islam on an external level, they're okay. And we have no means of assessing what their real feelings are. But here in the Mamluk period, as Tamer el-Laythi showed, there is a great concern about their inner feelings, because now they have power over other Muslims. So I don't know, this is something that to think about on the other side of the Mediterranean.
Yeah, 2 points I'd make. Thank you very much. I think there are some similarities, there's also some differences. One point, it is really, I'd underline that there is, I come back to my text, that that it is speaking of the customs, rights, or modes of life differing from. And so this is obviously not something of inner belief. Modes of life and customs can be observed by others, whereas what you're believing cannot be observed.
Yeah, but
this
this
is
right that they're mentioning the Sabbath.
Yeah, of course. But at the point that the Christiani Novelli are making, or what they are saying, that they are being accused of, is that, and then the Pope reacts by giving them this, not asking but demanding that they give up to celebrate Shabbat. So I think it's important to see that they're being accused of being somehow different. I really make this point. They have different ways, and they are having it. And I think maybe this is not impossible, but what does it mean? Many of them still live in the former Judaica. And of course there's intermarriage between. We don't have so many sources for intermarriage. I think I found 9 cases of marriages by the Christian family, both for the second half of the 15th century. They're all monogamous. And if you look at business partnerships are always among themselves. I found one with a other Christian, a non-new Christian, and one with a Jew. All the other business partnerships, and I found about 50, I think, are among them. And since business partners and relation between family relations go often hand in hand, so it's very possible that this was. But it's not a matter of belief. This is one thing. And another point that I would make is, of course, here is this pressure they are under pressure, and they say it. They are being shunned by a part of the urban population. As I put it, it is, and obviously they are being can you say so, infamized? Yeah, and this means if you infamia in Latin in the canon law means that you can't hold public office. Yeah, so this is what happens if you're accused of being a heretic, that you lose public offices, and the question of infamia is what they are. This is what they are addressing. There is infamia, and they're being shunned by a part of the society. Not all, because until 57 you find them in the witness lists, even in testaments by other Christians with pious foundations, and you won't ask someone to be a witness in your last will if you weren't thinking that he's a good Christian. So it's not the whole of the urban society that holds them for being problematic. It's just come up. Okay.
Yeah, I have 2 comments. One regarding the overall text, and the second one regarding the terminology. Regarding the overall text, I would suggest a little bit less positivistic interpretation of that. Here we have a deal. It's a kind of deal between the Pope and maybe the new Christians or the Archbishop of Trani. And the deal is, okay, I the Pope, will not send a particular inquisition if you will accept to be under a catechetical control. That is, I will enforce you to behave as proper Christians. And that means that we don't necessarily must read that they should go to the church on Sunday. That is, they didn't go to the church. No. That is, we have to enforce that these people will regularly go to the church. Maybe they already go. But now we are enforcing catechesis instead of inquisition. And this tells a lot concerning how to interpret all these kind of customs, whether they were customs that has to do to Jewish belief, or to perhaps oftentimes to a kind of link with the tradition of belonging, customs. Only one thing concerning that divorce, I didn't see a lot the accusations of divorce against conversos in the Iberian Peninsula. Maybe this could be an echo of, it's not a leitmotif, the divorce. this could be perhaps an echo that something indeed happened there specifically. I don't know. Concerning the terminology, let's begin by the end. The term marrano, it's a polysemic term, and he entered in Italy already at the beginning of the 15th century, perhaps even before, in different ways, and not only through Venice, but you have different ways, and it meant different things at the same time. And you can see in the classic study of Arturo Farinelli, Marrano Storia del Vituperio, but very recently Stefania Pastore, she tried to give us a kind of periodization of the meaning of Marrano. I have to say she has great difficulties to separate the meaning and according to the different age. And finally, the term Cristiani Novelli, Cristiani Cristiani Nuovi. I think that your case is very interesting, because again, maybe I am wrong, but this is one of the first time that the Christian establishment uses this term instead of neophyte, for example, or instead of conversi, like in England, Domus Conversorum, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me that this occurred particularly during the 13th century. Maybe I am wrong again. And perhaps this has to do with that this neologism, perhaps it is a neologism, New Christian. We think it's a very old term, but I think it's a neologism that came out during the 13th century, and maybe it's a contraction between different terms. I will suggest one. One is coming from the juridical language. Homo novo is, according to Roman law, it's a criminal who now is acquitted, or he was acquitted of his crimes, and now he opens a new life. And we have a nobler idea, is the proto-Renascentist idea of Petrarch and Dante and so on, of the novus homo, that is a person who, for the first time, he acceds to important social position, in spite of his debased origins. Perhaps this has something to do regarding the term nous. Regarding the term Christianus, we have to bear in mind that the 13th century is the time of the crystallization of the idea of the corpus mysticum. And the corpus mysticum, the idea of the Christian peoplehood, become very central and very important. And probably here we have the beginning of something that will, of course, will be transformed afterwards.
Okay. I have only one last remark, if I have. The fact that you read notarial documents, which I did to insist today. The interesting thing is that you find among the witnesses, how you identify these witnesses who are from among the nobles, because it is written like this, because they are identified in these documents after the 15th century, maybe later. So this begs the question, why they are identified as Cristiani, Novelli, Neophyte, whatever, Neophydi, Neophydos, all these terms, which are variations of the same thing, they are identified as such in all formal documents issued by anything legal in South Africa.
Okay, but this does not hold true for Puglia. In Sicily it may be different. The point is, it's really, even in the, and if you're looking at the labeling, the new Christians are somehow in between Jews and Christians. Christian is never designated as a Christian in the notarial deed because it's It's just obvious. A Jew is always designated as a Jew, Hebreus or Judaeus. Whereas the Christiani Novelli Neophiti, they are sometimes labeled as such and sometimes not. And if you look at, you have to look at the context in which they are labeled. And you can see in these situations of crisis, which means at the beginning or shortly after the conversion, you have them labeled. Then you have it when somehow their position in society is under debate. At the end of the 15th century, when you have the time of expulsion, of course you have to designate those who are being expelled. And the prosopographical, this is why the prosopographical work was so essential to my work. I had with a lot of looking at genealogy and stuff, I had to kind of identify the Christiani Novelli families. And then I could say, aha, you have people, have a family, there is a member that is already labeled as a Christiani Novelli around 1400. And then we have another one labeled as a Cristiano Novello around 1450. And then we have one 1500. But there are all, sometimes really there are gaps of about 2 generations where we find no one of this family being labeled in any document as being different. So this is what I mean. So it comes up and it kind of disappears again. And this also reflects this continuous negotiation of their position in the larger Christian society. And coming to terminology, maybe it didn't come across that well. I'm not talking about Italy as a whole. And I didn't want to say that I know what Morano means. I just can see from my sources that the term Morano was used to label the descendants of the converts of 1292. And that this happens for the first time in the late 15th century. Whereas before, they were always, when they were labeled as Neophiti or Cristiani Novelli, but ever since, I think it is 1497 is the first document where alts can also be labeled as Morano. But normally they are labeled as Cristiani Novelli even at this time. This is one point. And even, I don't know what is meant with it. It's just a label for them. It has to do, you can say there are some connotations of it. If you're looking at the documents from Venice, the first expulsion of the Marani, which is explained why there's a connotation with heresy, obviously. So, but of course, this is just one point. And the last point, I absolutely agree with you. We must not read this text positivistically. We must situate it in the social context in here. And it's not only a deal between the Pope and the Cristiani Novelli, because it affects also the other Christians. Because from now on, they have to treat the Cristiani Novelli benignly, and they must not shun them anymore. It's also directed at them. So it's kind of, there's a third party involved.
A comment and a question. Going on with what Claude was saying of the catechization, there's this wonderful record that might be a good example to compare in Granada in the 1500s of the recent converts applying to the Archbishop and asking him for guidance in the same lines as this, but without the threat of inquisition. But the answer is very much, you should do this and that, behave like this, behave like that, forget this, forget that. And it's very much like your record, very, very much. So it would be very interesting to see, but there's no inquisition in the middle, apparently. At least they don't mention.
According to the treaty of surrender, it couldn't be an inquisition.
No. Yes. And there isn't, and there won't be in many, many years. So there's no inquisition around, but the catechization trend is there. The same, very similar. And then the question would be, is there a difference between, when you say some of them are termed Neophiti and some other are not? What we find in Andalusian towns is that there was a kind of assault of converts, this time Muslim converts, on the positions of the town councils. So you might find we have what we call the 24 councillors in the city, and in some cities like Jaén, they are all converts, all of them. We don't know from the sources because they have baptized and they disappear, but we know from other sources. So these ones are never ever termed anything, nothing. No Moriscos, no new converts, no converts de Moro, nothing. Whereas they are prosecuting Jewish converts, they are prosecuting other Moriscos and everything. So would you have the same sensation in your record?
I would say that I have found about, I think it is, I don't have it now exactly at the moment, but I think I found 21 or 23 families in Hungary where members of the family at one time or more than one member was labeled as a neophyte or neophytus Christianus Novus, Christiano Novello. But I couldn't see a pattern in a way, when only that I can see regulated was in times of crisis. Even people that were in high positions in certain times were labeled as a Cristiano Novello. For instance, at the end of the 15th century, one of the most important counselors of King Ferrand I was of the Cristiano Novello family of Trani. He was in several embassies to Ferrara, even the Curia, the King of France, and he was also labeled as in documents from Apulia as a Cristiano Novello, and also for other members of other high-standing families. So I wouldn't see a negative correlation between social position and, say unlabeling, or a correlation between social high position and non-labeling.
I have a few questions, and perhaps some of them are beyond the ambit of the session itself, but let's see how we go. First of all, I'd like to go back. I would like to think more about political context. You said in one of your comments, which I found very interesting, that between 1341 and I think you said in 1446, right, there's no actions against or no. So, hey, what is the political? Let's have some. Do we know, or can we say what the political context is? And if we go slightly further back, right, these mass conversions that happened in the late 13th century are, I think, in a way, we talked about this before, but I'm not going to say it out, are the exception that proves the rule. Right? That where rulers, Christian rulers, have strong control, there aren't conversions, because they're not interested in losing their Jewish. You can have individual conversions here and there, but there are no. And here you have an area in 1290s which is, I think, politically unstable, and the Dominicans are able or some Dominicans are able to take advantage or whatever, and bring about these. So again, the political situation here is very interesting in trying to figure out what is happening, and can you shed any light on that? Moreover, Trani itself was a center of learning, Jewish learning, before the conversions. Can you trace what happens to the rabbinic families, or in the prosopography that you actually did? Can you trace what happens to them? And the third question is more for David, but I don't know if he's going to want to address it here. Could you? What you gave us, it was very, very impressive, but very dense. And I would like if you were able to unpack some of the ideas that you put forward in relation to this document. Okay, how does this document feed into the ideas that, or the framework that you were trying to create?
So you may begin. I have already said it, so.
Well, basically, the document serves as a kind of platform because it addresses the question of, it addresses the population of converts, all the converts to Christianity, and it's trying to, let's put it, to make them dismiss like all kind of conduct while retaining in legal terms, retaining and in other terms also a distinct entity. Now, I use this as a platform to observe dynamics within dynamics within conversion or converts or ex-4 converts or converts which came back to Judaism, which returned to Judaism, in order to reveal various aspects in Jewish model, in late medieval and early Jewish history. This is basically what I try to do, and I try to focus on two types of conversion, basically perceptions of conversion. Basically, one which Jew basically is being peeled off all of his customs and entering like a kind of a universal Christian universal area. The other one which is doing basically the same action, but he retains like a distinct entity. You can find it in texts, for example. I gave example of the Jewish ethnographs of the convents, which exactly see the shell, the customs which surround the Jew. There's a kind of a shell which once will be taken off. The Jew will basically enter like Christian universal society. On the other hand, you can take many. I think the source of the likely anti-Semitic may be perception of the Jews. Maybe it's already in the 12th century in Bruni, maybe, but it certainly exists, for example, in the writings of the later Martin Luther, which examine, for example, both Catholicism and Judaism as a kind of shell which surrounds like Christian, true Christian. Now, while amidst the Jew, eventually, what is there is an entity. Even if you will dig, even if you will pull off all his customs, all his errors, etc., eventually what will be left will be like an entity which is basically satanic, demonic, or contaminated. These two modes of like the Jew which entered Christian society with no remnant, and the Jew which entered Christian society with a sort of like contaminated remnant, are two modes of identity which Christian society construct regarding the Jews. They form later anti-Semitism, one of them in another, and other modes of like assimilation into Christian society. On the other hand, the Jews themselves create patterns of identity which are constructed upon those configurations. I gave, for example, a similar case to Judaism, basically, which is a secularized, a Christian secularized Jew, which basically get rid of all these contacts. The other, which could be like enlightened, later, which enlightened or semi-enlightened, and later national identity, which goes through the same process, basically, but retain kind of a Jewish remnant, which he fills up again through historical constructions, etc., through perceptual identifications, etc. So basically, yes. So again, to many issues concerning modern, late medieval and early and late modern Judaism are like flowing from these exact issues, from this exact like location of trying to locate the Jew within this framework.
Yes, maybe the first question. Unluckily, we cannot see any continuity between the Jewish community of Tani and the New Christians because there are the sources. On a cosmographical level, it's not possible to trace, to draw the line from the Jews that were there before the mass conversion and the New Christians after. So it's a shame, but we just can't do it. It's very, very interesting for a lot of reasons, but it's just not possible, unfortunately. The first thing, you're absolutely right, it has a lot to do with the political circumstances, and although my presentation focused on the case of Tani and the book I've written, I tried to combine both approaches, the political circumstances of the whole kingdom, it's a kind of the close-up, but also the wide-angle shot, and you have to kind of switch between the both of them to get the complete picture. And yeah, one of the reasons the mass conversion itself can be seen as has a lot to do with political fragmentation, with the weakness of the monarchy, or the crisis of the monarchy ever since the Sicilian pestos, which is really a problem which occurred 10 years ago. And 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 this is one of the, also the fragmentation in terms of the power of the Jews, because as I said, the Jews were not under the jurisdiction of the king, but under the jurisdiction of the churches, the bishoprics and some abbeys. And this only because the kings gave them away, the privilege, most of the churches, they gave these rights away to the churches. And already Frederick II tried to regain them. Tried, but he didn't succeed. And when the Dominicans appeared on the scene after 1266 and started to persecute Jews, started to try to convert them with sermons, and then persecuted converts being suspected of relapse, and also Jews who were suspected of helping relapsing converts. Contrary to the King of Aragon, the King of Naples didn't put didn't stop that, because when that was okay, because it kind of the Dominicans, by converting the Jews, kind of broke them out of the rule of the bishops, and as Christians they were subjects of the king. So it was interesting. You also have some cases that the king or members of the royal family acted as godfathers, and this is also reflected in the name. There's the Prince of Taranto, Philippus, who acts as godfather of one of the convert, and he is called Philippus Dicta de Principe, Dictus de Principe, so he even bears the princely rank as his surname, which is interesting. But this attempt at centralization, in a way, or in regards on who has fails in the middle of the 15th century. For this has to do also with dynastic struggles, King of Naples, between the different branches of the House of Anjou, and later between Aragon and Anjou, which goes on to the 15th century. And another point is the inquisitorial activity collapses around the middle of the 14th century because it meets strong opposition by local powers. By the bishops, again, we have the document I mentioned in my introduction in 1328. The Archbishop of Trani obtains a papal bull that exempts his dioceses from inquisitorial action. And he mentions that the inquisitors had forced or put pressure, solved any pressure on the Jews, that most of them converted, and now they're pressing the neophyte. And for this reason, he wants the Pope to prohibit the inquisitors to inquire in his dioceses. And there are also other, and I found it also in Bari. It's not the Archbishop, but it's the Basilica of San Nicola who opposes to the Inquisition in Brindisi, and its princes, local nobles. So the fragmentation of the political landscape of the Kingdom of Naples in the 14th century is very, very important to understand why things happened the way they did happen.
In Dove's close reading of the text, the Pope Eugenius IV, so he wants not inquisition but a Christian education. That would be an equivalent of what will be Talavera's strategy in Spain some 40 years later, you know, and also the strategy of the chronicler Hernando de Pulgar, who writes that in Andalusia, in Seville, the young girls in the converso homes, they never got out of home, so they know nothing about Christianity. So we should give them an education to bring them images of Christ, etc. And this is, I think, perhaps it was really so that it is southern Spain. The young girls didn't go out of home. I don't know what you think about that as a reality at that time. And so this is the only problem is that this strategy of education failed. You know, those conversos were stiff-necked, and so within 2 years after some Talavera did some sermons, etc., between 78 and 81 at the beginning, and there was a swift turn towards using force. But so the education strategy, perhaps indeed Genius of Force wanted that, which means that indeed, just as in Andalusia, the young people were supposed to have no Christian education. This is what we have to bring to them. Perhaps also here it is what is written, that they are not baptized until late and they don't show up to mass, and etc. Et and we should force them to have this, and it will give good results. This is what.
Let me just very briefly add, Eugenius, the follower of Eugenius is Nicholas V, the same who reacted against the segregation of the conversos of Toledo. Why I am saying that? Because Eugenius, as a post-conciliar pope, as a pope who had in mind, like Nicholas, the traumatism of Jan Hus and the Hussitism, that is the division of Christianity, is pleading for peace and for union between Christians. And he mentioned that, and this goes hand by hand with what you are suggesting to.
I confess that I've been suffering from savage bouts of jet lag this afternoon, so I may have, I don't know what I missed, but you talked about a whole series of conversions in a number of cities, right? And I wonder if you could talk, if there's any way to talk about why this long period of identification of new Christians and neophytes seems to happen in one place and not in the other. Is there anything that allows you to explore?
Yeah, this is a difficult question, but I think it has a lot to do with the matter of them being subject to the church in Hungary, and the church in succeeding to imposing its power upon them even after the conversion. Obviously, the church in other parts of the Kingdom of Naples was not as successful. So this is to collect taxes from them, and to force them under her jurisdiction. The church had to label also the descendants of the converts as neophyte. And in the first document where we have the application of the label also to descendants of converts is a document from Tania in the year of 1377. And the year 1377, the city, the commune, had a struggle with the archbishopric concerning the fair economic matters, but the city also accuses the Archbishop of Trani of still collecting taxes or demanding taxes by the neophyte, and still forcing them under their jurisdiction, although they should enjoy the same rights and the same freedom as the other people in Trani. So we can see it here. This is the first time that neophytus is also applied to descendants of converts. On the other hand, in a way, the label neophytus and Christiano Novus, to come back to you can see contexts, two contexts in which these labels were used. And one is the Inquisition. Neophytus was used for the first time in documents by inquisitors in 1294, and Christiano Novus is used in documents about taxation. And later also neophytus is being used in these privileges of tax exemption I meant. And these privileges say the tax exemption is only valid for the converts until in lifetime, for a lifetime. So if the royal bureaucracy had used the term, It would have meant that it had accepted also not only the converts but also their descendants from taxes. So they weren't interested in that. So this is part of the story, I'd say. And you find the label mainly in China. You might find it mainly in this context of the rule of the local church about the neophytes. So it has a lot to do with, as I said, it's a fragmented political landscape, and even later situations changed from one region to another. As I said, the Christiani Valley got expelled from Trani, and they settled in Valletta, which is 30 kilometers from Trani. And they're there, and they're notaries and they're judges, and they act as procurators for the church, where when they in Trani they are considered heretics, and for this reason are not being readmitted. So this is a complex story.
If there are no further questions, then I think we can conclude.